Rain hammered the windshield as the ambulance skidded sideways on Franklin Avenue, tires screaming against wet asphalt, and Colton Reyes stood on the brake with everything he had. The black and tan German Shepherd did not move. He planted himself in the road, ribs heaving, teeth bared, barking as if he meant to bite the engine itself. In the back, a 7-year-old boy was dying. Before we go on, drop a comment telling me what corner of the world you're listening from and hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one. Colton leaned on the horn until his palm ached, but the dog only barked louder. Rain sheeted off the shepherd's soaked coat and made his eyes look almost silver under the street lamp. Behind Colton, his partner, Shelby Doran, was crouched over the boy on the stretcher, 2 fingers pressed to the small, pale throat, and her voice came sharp and low through the sliding window. His pulse is dropping, Colt. Whatever that is, drive around it. Colton flicked his eyes to the shoulder of the road, but the alley on the right was too tight, the ditch on the left too deep, and the dog stood exactly in the center of both lanes like a stone that would not roll. Then the shepherd did something Colton had never seen a stray do. He wheeled around, ran 3 quick steps toward the mouth of the alley beside the old feed store, stopped, looked back over his shoulder, and barked once. Not the ragged bark of an animal defending a scrap of food. A short, clean, urgent bark, the kind a working dog gives when he wants a handler to follow. Colton went cold from his scalp to his boots. He knew that bark. He had heard it 100 times in the sunny parking lot behind the Millbrook Police Department, back when Officer Devin Whitaker used to run drills with his K-9 partner every Thursday afternoon. He had heard it the day of the county fair, when the shepherd had found a missing toddler under a picnic table. And he had heard it, one last time, at the funeral 8 months ago, when a black and tan dog had lain down at the foot of a folded flag and refused to lift his head for the entire service. He looked at the tag on the dog's collar, glinting through the rain, in the shape of a small metal badge. K-9 Ranger, Millbrook Police. Colton whispered the name out loud without meaning to, and the dog turned his head toward the sound and barked again, sharper this time, and took 2 more steps into the alley. Colton hit the radio hard enough to bruise his knuckle. "Dispatch, this is Medic 3-1. I need a 2nd unit rolling to Franklin and Pine, and I need it now. We have a possible second scene. I'm going on foot." Shelby's voice cracked through the intercom, disbelieving. "Colt, you cannot leave this rig. The boy needs the trauma bay in 4 minutes, not 5. Colton was already unbuckling, already opening the door, already stepping down into the cold black water pooling along the curb. "Drive," he said. "Get him there." "I know that dog. That dog is telling me something." And the last time somebody ignored what that dog was telling them, a child got found alive when everybody else had given up. "Go!" He slammed the door shut, and the ambulance surged past him with its lights spinning red across the wet brick storefronts, and Colton was alone in the rain with a shepherd who was already running. Ranger did not look back after that. He led Colton 3 blocks in a straight, purposeful line, ears flat against the rain, paws splashing through gutters swollen with dead leaves, past the shuttered barbershop where Devon used to get his hair buzzed short every 3 weeks, past the little corner grocery where Paige Whitaker still bought oranges every Saturday morning with Hazel riding on her hip, past the darkened porches where families were inside, eating late dinners and watching sitcoms, and did not know that a dog was running for a life on the other side of their walls. Colton's boots were full of water inside of a block, and his lungs burned by the second, and he still could not close the gap between himself and the animal. He only kept up because the dog stopped at every corner and waited, tail rigid, until he saw Colton round the sidewalk, and then bolted again. They came around the last turn onto Bluebird Lane, and Colton saw it. The blue house, the little clapboard 2-story with the white shutters and the American flag on the porch post. The house where Devon Whitaker had raised his daughter and where his widow now lived alone with her. The front door stood open to the storm, A lamp lay in shattered pieces across the porch boards, its shade folded in on itself like a broken flower, the bulb cracked and dark. Somewhere inside, a television was murmuring low, one of those late cartoon channels, tinny music leaking through the doorway. Ranger went up the porch steps in a single leap and stopped just inside the threshold, whining now, not barking, and Colton's chest closed up around his heart. He knew that sound too. That was the sound a working dog made when it had found what it was looking for and needed a human to see. Colton stepped over the broken lamp and into the front hall, and there she was. Paige Whitaker lay face down at the foot of the stairs, one arm folded under her, one leg bent at a wrong angle, a spill of dark blood matting the pale hair above her ear. A laundry basket lay on its side 3 steps up, socks and t-shirts scattered down the runner. The banister had cracked cleanly in half at the top of the flight, and a jagged splinter of oak had come away with it. Beside her mother, in pink pajamas with a strawberry on the chest, sat a small blonde girl of 4 with her hand resting on her mother's cheek. Hazel Whitaker looked up at Colton with a face that was almost too calm and said in a voice so quiet he had to lean down to hear it, "Ranger went to get help like Daddy taught him. He wasn't supposed to leave, but Mommy fell, and I told him it was okay." Colton dropped to his knees beside Paige and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point beneath her jaw. It was there. Weak, slow, but there. Her skin was cool. She had been down a long time. He grabbed his radio again and called it in with a voice he barely recognized as his own, gave the address twice, asked how far, and heard the dispatcher say a second unit was 3 minutes out and already turning off main. 3 minutes. He looked at Hazel. He looked at the dog. Ranger had walked around the fallen woman in a slow, careful circle and now lay down against her side, pressed his flank warm against her ribs, and did not move his eyes off her face. That was how they were when the paramedics came through the door with a stretcher and a spine board, and blue jackets streaming water onto the floor. Paige Whitaker, 34 years old, widow, mother of 1, went to Millbrook General with a fractured skull, a broken wrist, and a heartbeat that held on because a dog would not. The boy in the first ambulance made it too. His name was Owen Marsh, and he was in the pediatric surgical wing an hour later, opened up under bright white lights by a heart surgeon flown in from Cleveland that morning for a scheduled case, still there, still gloved, still willing. His mother wept in the hallway with a stranger's arms around her, a stranger who turned out to be a nurse whose own son had died 6 years earlier, and neither of them knew each other's names, and it did not matter. Owen came out of surgery at 4 in the morning with a new patch on the wall of his heart and a chance to see his 8th birthday. His parents would tell that story for the rest of their lives, and every time they told it, they would begin with the words, "There was a dog." Colton stood in the doorway of Paige Whitaker's hospital room a little after 7 the next morning, with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He had not gone home. He had not changed out of his wet uniform, and his boots had squeaked all the way down the tiled corridor, and a night nurse had brought him a blanket at some point that he had draped over his shoulders and forgotten. Paige was awake now. Stitches ran along her scalp above her right ear, black and neat, and her wrist was in a lightweight cast, and a bruise was blooming purple down the side of her face. Hazel was curled against her mother's side with her cheek on her mother's ribs, and her small hand fisted in the sleeve of the hospital gown. Ranger lay on the tile at the foot of the bed with his chin on his paws, eyes half open, tail flat, finally still. He had refused to leave. A rookie officer named Denise Ortiz had tried to lead him to a squad car, and the shepherd had lain down under Paige's stretcher and shown one clean white tooth, and Denise had let him ride in the back of the ambulance with a blanket over him instead. He had walked in on his own, 4 feet through the sliding doors of the emergency room, and no one had asked him to leave. Paige turned her head slowly on the pillow when she saw Colton in the doorway. Her eyes were shadowed and dark, but they focused, She whispered, "Thank you." And then, after a long breath, she added, "But you should not thank me. You should thank him." She turned her chin toward the foot of the bed, where the shepherd lifted his ears at the movement and did not otherwise stir. Colton crossed the room and sat down in the vinyl chair beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Rain still ran down the window. A cart rolled past in the hallway. He said quietly, "Paige, how long had you been on the floor?" She thought about it. "I don't know. I fell just before Hazel's cartoon started. I remember the music. Then it was nothing. Then I woke up in the ambulance." Colton wet his lips. "That show goes on at 6. It was almost 8 when I found you." Paige closed her eyes. "I would not have made it, would I?" Colton looked at his hands. He did not answer, because his answer would have been no. That was when Hazel spoke, and her voice was so bright and so ordinary that it made both adults look at her in surprise. She said, "The door was open, and I told Ranger to get help." And he pushed the screen with his nose, and then he squeezed. Colton frowned. Squeezed. Hazel nodded. Through the little door. The one Daddy said he would fix. Paige tried to lift her head, winced, sank back. She said, very slowly, "The mail slot." Devon had put in a bigger slot when they moved in, big enough for magazines, and it never quite latched. Devon had been going to fix it for 2 years. Colton looked at the dog on the floor. Ranger weighed almost 90 pounds. There was no way that mail slot was big enough, but the wooden frame was old and dry, and a determined animal with a purpose in his chest could break wood. Colton would find out later that the frame around the slot had cracked outward and that there were small splinters caught in the ruff of the dog's neck. Ranger had come through anyway. He had come through, and he had gone the only place he knew sirens went, toward the sound of one, and he had made an ambulance stop. For 3 days, that was the story. That was what everybody in Millbrook told each other over coffee at the diner and over back fences at the mailbox. And that was what the little weekly paper printed on the front page, above a photograph of a black and tan shepherd sitting proud on the hospital lawn, with Paige leaning on a cane beside him. "Hero dog saves widow of fallen officer," said the headline. And the story wrote itself, and everybody wept a little and shared it 100 times. And the mayor of Millbrook, a big red-faced man named Harlan Beckett, showed up on the hospital lawn with a plaque he had ordered, rushed from a shop in Columbus. He shook Paige's hand. He crouched down and tried to shake Ranger's paw. The shepherd looked past him without interest and did not lift a foot. The photograph was very charming, and it ran everywhere. But Colton could not sleep. On the 4th night, he sat at his own kitchen table with a bottle of beer he had not drunk, and turned the whole thing over in his mind again, and something in it would not lie flat. The banister. He had knelt beside Paige and looked at it. It had cracked cleanly at the top of the flight, and the splinter that had come away had been sharp as a knife. He was a paramedic. He had seen falls. Falls did not usually break a load-bearing oak banister at the top newel post. Paige weighed 130 pounds. The banister had been anchored with lag bolts. He had seen banisters like that in houses 100 years old still holding, and Paige had said something else that morning at the hospital that had not sat right in his head. She had said, "I remember the music." That meant she remembered starting down the stairs after Hazel's show had begun. But the laundry basket had been 3 steps up. If she had fallen on the way down, it should have been below her, not above. Unless she had been going up. But why would she carry a laundry basket up the stairs and then turn around and fall down? He picked up his phone and called Denise Ortiz. Denise was young, was 2 years out of the academy, was the officer who had let Ranger stay. She picked up on the 4th ring, groggy. Colton apologized for the hour and said, "Listen, when you cleared the house on Bluebird, did you check the back door?" Denise was quiet a long time. Then she said, "I checked the front. It was open. We came through it." Colton said, "So nobody checked the back?" Denise said, "We had a woman down and a paramedic on scene, Colt. We were focused." Then she added, "Why?" He said, because I have been thinking and something is not right. Come over and look with me tomorrow." She said, "We cannot go into that house without Paige, and Paige is being discharged in the morning, so maybe we go with her." They went. Paige came home to Bluebird Lane in Denise Ortiz's cruiser with Hazel in the back seat and Ranger's head on Hazel's lap. Colton followed in his pickup. The rain had passed, and October sun lay cold and gold along the sidewalks, and the neighbors came out onto their porches and clapped as the cruiser pulled up. Paige waved with her good hand and tried to smile, and Denise helped her out of the car, and the four of them walked up the porch steps together with the shepherd at Paige's hip. Paige stopped at the door. She had not been inside since the fall. She stood for a long moment with her hand on the frame, then she pushed it open and went in. The first thing she said, standing in the front hall, was that something was missing. Colton and Denise looked at her. Paige turned in a slow circle, her uncasted hand rising to her mouth. She said, "The picture." Above the mantel, over the small brick fireplace in the front room, there had hung a framed photograph of Devon Whitaker in dress uniform on the day he had graduated from the academy, with a young Paige beside him in a pale blue dress and a proud grin, and a puppy that was Ranger at 8 weeks old squirming in her arms. The nail was there. The picture was gone. Paige walked into the living room like someone in a dream. On the shelves beside the fireplace, Devon's medals had lain in a shadow box under glass. The shadow box was still on the shelf. It was empty. The little compartments inside where the medals had rested were bare, and the wall behind the shelf where he had kept the folded flag from the funeral was bare too. She sat down slowly on the couch and put her face in her hand. Denise Ortiz stopped acting like a helpful neighbor and started acting like a cop. She walked the house in a careful line, camera lifted. The back door had been jimmied at the strike plate with something narrow and hard, and the paint around the deadbolt was scratched fresh. Someone had come in through the back. Someone had been in the house before Paige fell, or someone had come in while she was on the floor, or someone had come in after. In the kitchen, a drawer stood ajar with the paper in it fanned out, the drawer where Paige kept insurance forms and the deed to the house. Devon's laptop, which had lived on the little desk in the corner of the living room since the day he died, was gone. His filing cabinet in the small back office had been opened, and the folder marked "Work" in Paige's neat handwriting had been rifled through and left on the floor. Denise crouched over that folder, pen in hand, and asked without looking up, "Paige, do you have anyone with a key to this house besides you?" Paige swallowed. She said, "One person, Marcus." Denise wrote it down. "Marcus who?" Paige said, "Marcus Whitaker, Devon's older brother." Denise wrote that down too. "Where does Marcus live?" Paige said. "Out on Mill Creek Road. He owns the trucking depot off the highway, the one behind the grain elevator. He and Devon had a falling out 10 years ago, but after Devon died, he asked me for a key so he could help around the house. Fix things. Take out the trash. Check on us. He came by every other week for a while." Denise looked up. "When did he last come by?" Paige thought about it, and then her face changed. "He came by that afternoon," she said. "He came by the afternoon of the day I fell. He wanted to talk about selling the house. He said he had a buyer." Colton felt the floor tip under him. He said, "Paige, why does Marcus want you to sell this house?" She said, "He says the neighborhood is going to change. He says there is a developer looking at all of Bluebird Lane. He says I should take the money now before the prices go down again. He has been asking for 6 months. He gets upset when I say no." Denise said quietly, "Define upset." Paige said, "The last time, 3 weeks ago, he broke a chair. I told him to leave. He came back the next day with flowers and an apology, and then he came by that afternoon and asked me one more time, and I said no one more time, and he left. And then I went upstairs to put laundry away, and I was coming back down, and the banister gave out." She stopped. She said, "Wait." She said no. I was coming up the stairs. The laundry basket was in front of me, and I was carrying it up, and I heard something on the landing behind me. She closed her eyes. She said, I don't remember. I heard something. I turned, and then I don't remember. Denise Ortiz stood very still. Then she said, Paige, I am going to ask you to stay here with Colton and with your daughter, and I am going to make a phone call, and I am going to have a couple of my people come look at that banister, and I am not going to let Marcus back inside this house until we know what happened. All right? Paige nodded without speaking. Ranger had come and put his head on her knee. His eyes were on the front door. That afternoon, an evidence technician named Kirby Vance, a heavy-set man with a soft voice who had known Devon Whitaker since kindergarten, came out from the county sheriff's office with a black kit and spent 2 hours on the stairs. He photographed the newel post from every angle. He ran a small flashlight beam along the crack. He crouched at the base of the banister and turned a lag bolt in his fingers and shook his head. Then he called Denise into the front hall and showed her. The lag bolts, he said, had been backed out, not sheared, not stripped. Someone had put a socket wrench on them and turned them until they came loose in the wood. 2 of the 4. Just enough that any weight leaning on the rail would bring the whole run down. He said this was not an accident. He said this was set up to look like one. Denise sat down on the 3rd stair and rubbed her hand over her mouth and said, Oh, Devon. Oh, buddy. What did you get yourself into? That night, Colton stayed on the couch in the Blue House with a blanket over him and Ranger lying on the rug beside him. Denise had posted a cruiser at the end of the block, unmarked, with an officer inside. Paige and Hazel slept upstairs behind a locked door. The house was dark and quiet, but Colton lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to the shepherd breathe. At some point after midnight, Ranger got up, walked to the front hall, sat and stared at the door. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply sat and watched. Colton got up too and stood in the archway. There was a car parked at the curb across the street with no lights on, a pickup, dark, an older model. Colton could not see anyone inside from that angle. He picked up his phone and called Denise. Denise called dispatch. A minute later, a set of headlights came down the block from the far end, and the pickup at the curb pulled away smoothly and drove off in the other direction without ever turning on its lights until it reached the intersection. The cruiser radioed back a plate. It ran to a Marcus Whitaker of Mill Creek Road. The next morning, Denise came to the door with 2 other officers in uniform and a warrant for Marcus's arrest. Colton learned later what happened at the depot on Mill Creek Road. Marcus met them in the yard between 2 parked semis, in a canvas jacket and a ball cap, with grease on his hands. He asked what this was about. Denise told him. He laughed. He said, Paige is confused. Paige fell. Paige is a widow with a head injury, and she is confused. Denise said, Get in the car, Marcus. He said, I want a lawyer. She said, That is exactly what you're going to get. And he did not resist, not then, not in front of his employees, not in front of the highway. But when Denise put her hand on his shoulder to walk him to the cruiser, Marcus looked over her head, past the trucks into a middle distance no one else could see, and said quietly, My brother was a fool, and Paige is a fool, and none of you know what you're stepping into. And Denise said, Tell it to the lawyer. And she put him in the back seat. Marcus was charged with breaking and entering, with theft, with tampering with a physical structure, and with attempted murder. He made bail the next afternoon on a cash bond posted by a man Denise Ortiz had never heard of, a man in a gray suit who paid it in $20,000 increments and did not give a name that anyone at the courthouse recognized. Marcus walked out of the county building with his ball cap tipped low over his eyes, got into the passenger seat of a black sedan idling at the curb, and rode away with a man behind the wheel who wore a wedding ring on his right hand and dark glasses, even though the sky was overcast. That was the first sign that this had never been about a house. Paige packed a bag that afternoon and moved with Hazel and Ranger into the little guest room over Colton's garage on the other side of town, because Denise had said, quietly and firmly, that Bluebird Lane was not safe. Colton lived alone. His wife had left him 3 years earlier, and there had been no one since, and he did not mind the company. He set up a small folding bed for Hazel and put a bowl of water on the kitchen floor for the shepherd. Ranger walked the perimeter of the house that first evening, stopping at every window, looking out before he lay down at Hazel's feet. They were sitting at the kitchen table on the second evening when Paige, working through a plate of scrambled eggs with her good hand, suddenly stopped chewing and said, "I forgot." She said it in the tone of someone remembering the name of a song. Then she got up, went to the little duffel bag she had packed, dug down under the folded clothes and pulled out a small, worn envelope. She said, "Devon left this. He gave it to me the week before the fire. He said, if anything ever happens to me, don't open this yourself. Give it to somebody honest with a badge." She held it out. Colton did not touch it. He said, "Paige, that was 8 months ago. Why did you not open it?" She said, "Because I trusted him." She said, "And because if I opened it, then he was really gone. And I was not ready." Colton took the envelope. He opened it at the kitchen table with Hazel and Paige watching. Inside was a single small key on a piece of red string and a folded slip of paper. The paper said in Devon Whitaker's blocky handwriting, "Box 214, First Federal, Millbrook. Ask for Nadine." He drove to the bank first thing the next morning with Denise Ortiz in the passenger seat. Nadine turned out to be a silver-haired woman of about 60 in a green cardigan who worked the safe deposit desk and had done since before either of them were born. When Denise showed her the key and the slip of paper, Nadine's face closed like a book. She said, "So it is time." She led them into the vault. Box 214 was on the bottom row. Inside were 3 items: a small black notebook, a cheap plastic flash drive, and a manila envelope with a photograph in it. Denise took gloves out of her jacket pocket before she touched any of it. On the front seat of Colton's truck, driving back through town, Denise opened the notebook and read the first page, and then she read the second, and then she said, "Oh, hell, oh, Devon, oh, hell." Devon Whitaker had spent the last year of his life quietly on his own time, and often at night, building a file on his own uncle, Chief Reginald Whitaker of the Millbrook Police Department. He had done it because he had been running a routine call 2 summers ago, a call that seemed to be a domestic dispute at the trucking depot on Mill Creek Road, owned by his brother Marcus, and he had walked into a back office and seen, on Marcus's desk, an inventory sheet for a shipment coming through the depot that did not match the manifest in the front office. He had noticed. He had not said anything. He had gone home and thought about it. He had gone back on another call 3 weeks later, and this time he had looked in the same office and seen a bank envelope on the desk with the name Reginald Whitaker paper-clipped to it, thick with cash. And that had been the moment his life changed. Because Chief Reginald Whitaker was his uncle, and Marcus Whitaker was his brother. And Devon Whitaker was the kind of man who could not see. The notebook laid it all out in patient, careful entries: dates, times, truck numbers, license plates, names of men who came and went from the depot after hours in unmarked panel vans, photocopies of shipping manifests, a quiet, methodical map of a smuggling ring that ran counterfeit prescription medication out of a warehouse 2 counties over, up through the Mill Creek Road depot, and out to bulk buyers in 3 states. It was not a huge operation. It was small enough to hide in the shadow of a legitimate trucking business, and it had been running for 6 years under the protection of a police chief who took an envelope every month and made sure no cruiser ever came down that dirt road at the wrong hour. Devon had put it all together, and in the last entry, dated the day before the warehouse fire, he had written a single line. "Told R I am going to the FBI on Monday. He looked me in the eye and told me to sleep on it. I do not think he was asking. Denise Ortiz set the notebook down on her knee and stared out the truck window for a long time. Then she said very quietly that fire was not an accident either. Was it? Colton said, I do not know. She said, I do. It never sat right. 2 men in the warehouse, Devon and a probationary named Kyle. Devon went in for a rescue and the roof came down. Kyle got out. Kyle transferred to Cincinnati a month later. Kyle bought a house he could not afford on his salary. Colton said, the fire chief ruled it accidental. Denise said, the fire chief plays golf with the police chief every Sunday morning. She said, Colt, this is not a small thing. This is not a burglary at Page's house. This is a chief of police. This is a man who signs my paycheck. This is a man whose brother-in-law is a superior court judge. We need to be very, very careful how we do this next part. She did not go back to the Millbrook Police Department that afternoon. She drove instead, with Colton beside her, 72 miles down the interstate to the field office of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Cleveland. She sat down in a small, windowless room across from a woman she had gone to the academy with, a woman named Karen Ollivant, who had left Millbrook 7 years ago for the state and never looked back. And she said, Karen, I need help. And Karen looked at the notebook and looked at the flash drive and looked at the photograph in the manila envelope, which turned out to be a picture of Chief Reginald Whitaker shaking hands with a man in a suit in the parking lot of the Mill Creek Road Depot, time-stamped a year before, and said, yeah, I bet you do. And then Karen picked up her phone. The next week was the longest week of Colton Reyes's life. Page and Hazel stayed hidden. The state investigators worked in silence. Marcus Whitaker walked around Millbrook a free man on bond, drove his black sedan through town, ate lunch at the diner every day, and once, at the intersection of Franklin and 4th, pulled up alongside Colton's pickup at a red light, rolled down his window, and smiled. He did not say anything. He just smiled. Colton did not roll his window down. The light turned green. Marcus drove on. That afternoon, Colton put a chain across the driveway of his own house and installed a floodlight over the back door. On the 6th day, Hazel woke up in the middle of the night crying and could not say why. Paige held her until she fell back asleep, and then Paige came downstairs and sat with Colton at the kitchen table with the shepherd at her feet, and she said, "We cannot live like this forever." Colton said, "I know." She said, "I want it to be over." He said, "It will be." Karen said, "The arrests are coming." She said, "When?" He said, "Soon." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Tell me something honest. Was Devon really going to the FBI on Monday?" Colton nodded. She said, "Then Reginald killed him." She said it like she was reading it off a page. She said, "My brother-in-law's uncle killed my husband." She said, "And then he took a photograph of my husband off my wall to see if I knew what my husband had known." She said, "And then he sent Marcus back to try to kill me on the stairs." She sat with that for a while. Then she said, "Colt, if you had not stopped for that dog." Colton said, "I know." She said, "I would have died in that hallway." She said, "And Hazel would have grown up next door to the man who did it." Colton reached across the table and took her good hand, and she did not pull it away. The arrests came on the 9th morning. State agents in gray jackets walked into the Millbrook Police Department at 8:15 in the morning and asked Chief Reginald Whitaker to come with them. He did not resist. He had known, Karen said later, that they were coming. He had been packing a duffel bag in his office for 3 days. He was 58 years old. 26 years on that department, 12 years as chief, and he walked out of the building in cuffs past a lobby full of his own officers who did not know whether to salute him or look at the floor. Marcus was picked up at the trucking depot an hour later. Kyle, the probationary who had gotten out of the warehouse, was pulled over on Interstate 71 just outside of Cincinnati and did not resist either. By noon, the state had a lawyer at the federal courthouse in Columbus asking for indictments on charges that went from conspiracy to distribute counterfeit narcotics all the way up to arson causing death and to conspiracy to commit murder. And the newspapers had it by 3, and the little weekly in Millbrook printed a special edition by 5 that had nothing on the front page but the words, "The watch ends." And the photograph beneath the words was the same photograph they had run 12 days before, of Ranger sitting proud on the hospital lawn beside Paige Whitaker. But it was not over. Colton would learn later that in the 2 hours between Chief Whitaker being arrested and Marcus Whitaker being arrested, someone had called Marcus. Someone inside the department, someone loyal, someone frightened. Marcus had not run. Marcus had done something worse. Marcus had driven from the depot to a small rental house on the east end of town where his own girlfriend lived with her 2 children, and he had not gone in. He had sat outside in the black sedan for 20 minutes thinking, and then he had driven, not out of town, not to the interstate, not to any state line, but back toward Bluebird Lane. Because Marcus knew that if Devon had left anything, Paige had it. And if Paige was talking, then everything Marcus had built and everything Marcus had covered up was already gone. And there was only one thing left that Marcus wanted before the state closed on him. He wanted to look Paige Whitaker in the eye. He wanted her to know that he had done it. He wanted in his last free hour to be the one who told her. He did not know that Paige was not at Bluebird Lane. He did not know she was 2 miles across town in the little guest room above Colton Reyes's garage. He drove to Bluebird Lane in the middle of the afternoon and found it empty and dark, and the fury of that emptiness broke something in him. He drove 3 blocks to the little corner grocery on Franklin, and he asked the old man behind the counter, Del Hooper, if Del had seen Paige Whitaker that week, and Del, who was 79 years old and half-deaf and full of the news of the arrests, said, "Oh, she is over at Colton Reyes's place, poor thing," and Marcus said thank you and left. Denise Ortiz got the call from Karen Olivant at 4:14 in the afternoon. Karen said, "Denise, Marcus is not where he is supposed to be. He was supposed to be picked up at the depot, but he left before we got there. His sedan is not at his house. His sedan is not at his girlfriend's. His sedan is not anywhere." Denise said, "Oh no." Denise said, "I know where he is going." And she started her cruiser and hit the lights and radioed the 2 units on shift, and she drove for Colton Reyes's house on Sycamore Street with her siren opening a gap in the afternoon traffic. Colton was in the kitchen with the back door propped open, chopping onions on a cutting board for dinner. Paige was on the couch with Hazel curled beside her, watching an old cartoon. Ranger was asleep on the rug by the front door, and it was the first afternoon in a week where the shepherd had not been sitting at attention, and Colton had looked at the sleeping dog and had thought, maybe it is over. Maybe we can breathe. He heard a car door close on the street. He did not think anything of it. Then Ranger's head lifted off the rug like it had been jerked by a wire. The shepherd was on his feet before Colton could set down the knife. Ranger's ears were forward, his hackles up, and a low growl started in his chest that Colton had never heard before. Colton took 2 steps into the living room. Ranger was staring at the front door. The doorbell rang. Marcus Whitaker was on the porch in his canvas jacket with the ball cap tipped low, one hand tucked casually in his pocket, and a smile that did not touch his eyes. Colton could see him through the small window in the door. He said, quietly, to Paige, "Take Hazel upstairs. Now." He did not raise his voice. Paige rose without a word, gathered Hazel against her hip with her good arm, and moved for the stairs. Ranger did not follow. Ranger stood in the middle of the living room, facing the front door with his teeth showing. Colton said, through the door, "Marcus, this is not a good day for a visit." Marcus said, from the porch, "I just want to talk to Paige." 2 minutes. Colton said, "Paige is not here." Marcus said, "That is not true, Colt. Del Hooper told me. Del would not lie. Colton said, Marcus, the state is looking for you. Get in your car, turn yourself in. Do not make this worse. Marcus said quietly, open the door, Colton. He said, you do not want me to break a window in your house, do you? And then his voice changed and got smaller and older, and he said, Colt, please. She has to know. She has to know what he did. I owe her that. Colton had a decision to make and about 3 seconds to make it. He made the wrong one. He unlatched the storm door. He kept the wooden inside door mostly closed, kept his boot braced behind it, and cracked it 2 inches to speak face to face. He said, Marcus, back up off the porch and we will talk. And Marcus took the hand out of his pocket, and there was a small dark handgun in it, and he shoved the door with his shoulder. 3 things happened in the same second. Colton went backward off his heels and hit the floor. Marcus came through the door with the gun coming up, and Ranger left the ground. The shepherd covered the distance from the middle of the living room to the front hall in one long lunge. 90 pounds of muscle and instinct and 8 years of training, and he did what he had been trained to do since he was 11 months old. He did not go for the throat. He did not go for the face. He went for the arm, holding the weapon. His jaws closed on Marcus Whitaker's forearm above the wrist and clamped down, and Marcus screamed, and the gun went off, and the bullet buried itself in the ceiling above the door and rained a little cloud of white plaster into the hallway, and the shepherd rode Marcus down onto the floor with his teeth still locked on the arm and would not let go. Colton scrambled up and kicked the gun across the hallway toward the kitchen. Marcus was screaming and swinging his free fist at Ranger's head, and Ranger did not flinch and did not release, because he had not been given the release command, and the only person in the world who had ever given him that command was already 8 months dead. Colton pinned Marcus's free arm with his knee and got his weight on Marcus's chest and said over and over, Ranger, out! Ranger, out! It's okay! Ranger, out! The dog's yellow-brown eyes flicked toward him, but the jaws did not open. Colton did not know the release word. Devon had never told him. Then, from the stairs, a small voice said, Brave, and Ranger let go. He backed off Marcus in one clean movement, sat down at the foot of the stairs, and looked up at Hazel Whitaker, who was sitting 3 steps up in her pink pajamas with her chin on her knees and her mother's arm around her shoulders. Hazel said, Daddy said the word was brave. She was crying and she was smiling at the same time. Colton kept his weight on Marcus, who was moaning and clutching his ruined forearm, and reached for his phone with his free hand. Denise Ortiz kicked the storm door the rest of the way open 30 seconds later with her hand on her sidearm. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the tableau in the front hall. Marcus Whitaker on his back, dog-bitten and cuffed by his own good hand to the leg of the coat rack with a bootlace, which was what Colton had had within reach. The handgun on the tile 10 feet away. Colton on his knees beside Marcus with his phone still in his hand. Ranger sitting at the foot of the stairs, looking up at a 4-year-old in pink pajamas. Denise let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 6 years. She said, "Oh my God," she said, "is anybody hurt?" Colton said, "Only him." Denise said, "Good," and she came in and did her job. Marcus went from the hospital to the county jail 2 days later. His arm had been sewn back together by the same trauma surgeon who had patched Owen Marsh's heart, which is the kind of small joke Millbrook, Ohio, was known to hand out on a bad month. He did not make bail this time. The man in the grey suit did not come. That was the moment when the whole ring understood that Chief Whitaker's protection had ended, and by the end of that week, 3 more men associated with the depot had been picked up in 3 different states, and a federal indictment had been unsealed in Cincinnati that ran 42 pages long. Kyle, the probationary who had walked out of the warehouse, cut a deal. He told the state in a small windowless room with a lawyer at his elbow and a camera in the corner that he had been paid $20,000 in cash to leave a can of accelerant in the storage room where Devon Whitaker was searching for a supposedly trapped homeless man on the night of the fire. He had known the roof was rigged to come down. He had known Devon would not walk out. He had done it anyway because the chief had told him to, and he had needed the money, and he had thought he could live with it. He was wrong. He said, on camera, into the lens, "I am sorry. I am so sorry." And then he pled guilty to felony murder and got 25 to life. And Karen Olivant walked out of the interview room and cried quietly in the hallway for a friend she had known in the academy who had made it through, and for one she had known who had not. Reginald Whitaker did not cooperate. He did not need to. Devon had done all the work. His trial was set for the following spring, and Karen said, walking Colton and Page through the case in her small office, that with the notebook and the flash drive and the photograph and Kyle's testimony, they had him. They had him for the fire. They had him for the smuggling. They had him for conspiracy to commit murder against Page. He would die in prison. He would die in prison, and everyone in Millbrook would know why. Page, sitting in the small hard chair across from Karen's desk, took that in without expression. She said, only at the end, quietly, "My husband died so that other people would not be poisoned by counterfeit pills, and my husband's brother tried to kill me because I would not sell a house." She said, "Tell me those are the same story." Karen said, "They are the same story." Page said, "Then okay." And she got up and walked out of the building with Colton beside her. There was a memorial ceremony in the little park downtown 3 weeks later on a bright cold Saturday, the leaves gone from the maples and drifting brown against the base of the bandshell. The town of Millbrook renamed the corner of Franklin and Pine, the corner where the ambulance had stopped in the rain, and installed a bronze plaque on the lamppost. The plaque said, "On this spot, on the night of October 15th, K9 Ranger, Millbrook Police, refused to move, and 2 lives were saved." Below that, in smaller letters, it said, "Officer Devon Whitaker, end of watch, February 2nd. Owen Marsh, who was 8 years old now with a small pink scar down the center of his chest, cut the ribbon in front of the plaque with a pair of oversized scissors while his mother stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder and cried without shame. Page and Hazel Whitaker stood beside them, and Ranger sat between Page and Hazel with his tail curled around his front paws and did not fidget through any of it. He was 5 years old. He was strong and quiet and calm, and looked at the small crowd of neighbors and townspeople with the steady, patient attention of an animal who had once carried a whole town on his shoulders for one long rainy night, and had not felt the weight since. After the ceremony, an old woman Page did not know came up to her at the edge of the crowd. She was very small and very tidy, and she had a hat with a feather in it. She took Page's good hand in both of hers and said, "My grandson lives in Toledo. He is a diabetic. He got a bottle of insulin last year that was not insulin. It nearly killed him. He is fine now." Then she said, "Thank you." She said it to Page. And then she looked down at the shepherd sitting at Page's knee, and she said it to him too, "Thank you," and she walked away without giving her name. Page stood in the pale sun and watched her go. Hazel tugged her mother's sleeve and said, "What did the lady say?" And Page said, "She said thank you, baby. She said thank you." Colton drove them home. Not to Colton's house, home to the Blue House on Bluebird Lane, which had been cleaned and repaired and cleared by the state, and had a new banister and a new lock on the back door and a new picture over the mantel. An enlarged copy of the old one Marcus had taken, printed from a file Page had kept on her computer. Devon in his uniform, and Page in her blue dress, and a puppy squirming in her arms. Ranger walked in the front door and stopped in the hallway and stood for a moment sniffing the air, then walked slowly around the living room, past the couch and past the little desk in the corner and past the bookcase, and lay down in the middle of the rug in a patch of afternoon sunlight and put his chin on his paws and let out a long, slow breath. It was the sound a dog makes when he is home. Paige stood in the doorway and put a hand over her mouth and did not, for the first time in a long time, cry. There was a party, quietly that night, in the Blue House. Colton was there. Denise Ortiz was there. Kirby Vance was there. A few of Devon's old shiftmates were there. Owen Marsh's parents brought a lasagna and a small blonde boy who insisted on sitting on the floor next to Ranger the whole evening with a small, careful hand on the shepherd's shoulder. Paige made coffee and passed around pieces of an apple pie somebody had brought, and people took turns telling small stories about Devon and about Ranger and about the night in October. At one point, Denise stood up with her mug in her hand and said, "Listen, I want to say something." And the room got quiet. Denise said, "I have been a cop in this town for 6 years. I loved Devon. I did not know what he was carrying. I did not know what any of us were carrying, and I am ashamed of that. But I know this now." She looked around the room. She said, "We work in a place where a chief was crooked. That does not mean the work was crooked. The work was good. Devon was the work. The dog was the work. Owen is the work. Paige and Hazel are the work. The work goes on, and I'm going to keep doing it. That is all." Somebody in the corner said, "Hear, hear." And they all drank coffee and the party went on. Later, when everyone else had gone home, Paige and Colton stood on the porch. The night was cold and clear. Somewhere down the block, a leaf blower was running. Paige said, "Colt." Colton said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you for stopping." Colton said, "I did not stop." He did. Paige said, "You both stopped." Colton looked at his boots. He said, "I have been thinking." She said, "About what?" He said, "About Devon." She waited. He said, "Devon trained that dog to know that when the uniform ends, the watch does not." I did not understand that when he said it, and I have heard him say it 100 times. I understand it now. He said, "Paige, that is not a dog thing. That is a man thing. I have been a paramedic for 11 years. I have carried 37 people who did not make it. And I never once thought about my watch ending until Devon died. And I sat at the funeral and I looked at that dog lying on the flag and I thought, what do I do when I take this uniform off?" He said, "I think I might know now." Paige did not say anything. She just took his hand. Hazel came out onto the porch in her pink pajamas with her feet bare on the cold wood and looked up at both of them without surprise and said, "Ranger wants to sleep in my room. Is that okay?" Paige said, "Honey, of course." Hazel said, "Forever." Paige said, "Forever, sweetheart." Hazel said, "Okay." And she turned around and went back inside, and neither of the adults moved for a long time. Ranger slept at the foot of Hazel Whitaker's bed that night and every night that came after. He never once in all the years that followed left the yard again. He did not need to. The person he had gone out into the rain to find was safe. The house he had come home to was safe. The child he lived to protect was safe. Once, in the following spring, a delivery driver rang the front doorbell one evening at dinner time with a package for the neighbors that had been misaddressed, and Ranger came to the door beside Paige, and the driver said, "Whoa, that is a beautiful dog." And Paige said, "Yes, he is." And the driver said, "Is he friendly?" And Paige looked down at the shepherd and thought for a long moment about the answer to that question. She said, "At last, he is loyal." And that was enough. The driver smiled and left. Ranger watched him go from the porch until the truck turned the corner. Then he came inside and lay down under the kitchen table where Hazel was drawing at her placemat, and he closed his eyes. There were other endings, small ones, that summer. Reginald Whitaker was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in a federal penitentiary in West Virginia. Marcus Whitaker took a plea and was sentenced to 40 years without parole. Kyle served his time in a state facility in southern Ohio, and 4 years in, started a program for at-risk boys in the prison chapel, and wrote a letter to Paige asking for her forgiveness. And Paige, after a very long thought about it, wrote a very short one back that said only, "I do not owe you my forgiveness, and I'm not going to give it to you, but I'm telling you to keep going with those boys anyway because I think Devon would want you to." Kyle read that letter every day for the rest of his sentence. Colton Reyes did not go back to work as a paramedic. He passed his exam at the State Police Academy the next fall at the age of 34, older than anyone else in his class, and he graduated in the spring, and he applied and was hired to the reorganized Millbrook Police Department, which had a new chief, a woman named Yvette Palermo, who had been brought in from Dayton, and who had made Denise Ortiz her deputy chief on day one. Colton was assigned to patrol, and on his very first night on the beat, he pulled onto Bluebird Lane with his lights off and idled at the curb for 2 minutes with the engine soft, and looked up at the second-floor window of the Blue House, and saw the small nightlight in Hazel's room, and saw, silhouetted against it, the shape of a large German shepherd sitting up on the sill, head tilted, watching him. Colton lifted a hand. Ranger did not move, but Colton was sure somehow that he had seen. He drove on. Paige Whitaker sold the house on Bluebird Lane 2 years later, for a fair price, to a young couple who were expecting their first child, and she moved into a smaller place across town, where the yard was smaller, but the sun was better, and where Ranger had a soft dog bed in a patch of afternoon light on the sunroom floor. She married Colton Reyes on a bright, cold Saturday in October, 5 years to the week after the night of the rain, in the little park downtown, in front of the bronze plaque on the lamppost. Hazel Whitaker, 9 years old, carried the rings on a small pillow, and Ranger, who was 10 years old by then, and grey in the muzzle, walked her down the aisle. He did not need a leash. Owen Marsh, 13 and taller than his mother, played the harmonica at the reception. Del Hooper from the corner grocery cried into his handkerchief. Denise Ortiz gave the toast. She said, "We do not know why God gives some of us dogs and takes some of us early and lets some of us walk out of warehouses when we should not have and puts some of us in the road on rainy nights." She said, "But I have been a cop long enough to know that we owe each other everything we can give, and we owe the ones who came before us a promise to keep going. And I have been in this town long enough to know that when a shepherd stands in the middle of Franklin Avenue and will not move, you get down out of the truck and you follow him, because there is a widow at the end of the alley and there is a child on the stairs, and there is a story you cannot see yet, and it is your job to see it." She raised her glass. She said, "To Devon, to Ranger, to all of them." The room said it back. The bronze plaque on the corner of Franklin and Pine is still there today. Somebody, nobody knows who, keeps a small enameled dog collar looped around the base of the post and replaces it every winter when the weather knocks it loose. The collar has a small round tag on it in the shape of a badge. The tag says K9 Ranger. Under that, in smaller print, it says, "End of watch, July 9th and a year." And after that year, in the smallest print of all, 3 words. "Well done, boy." Sometimes a stranger passing through Millbrook stops at the corner and reads it and stands there a minute, and does not always understand what they are looking at, and moves on. Sometimes a schoolchild on the way home from the elementary 2 blocks over stops and crouches down and touches the collar with a careful finger and says something quiet. Sometimes an old paramedic named Colton Reyes stops on the corner in a state police uniform on a rainy October night and looks at the plaque and thinks about a dog who taught him that the uniform ends, but the watch does not. And a long time after all of it, on a warm afternoon in June, in a small yard behind a small house on the good side of town, a large old shepherd with a grey muzzle lay down in a patch of sunlight beside a laughing 9-year-old girl who was reading him a book about a horse. The girl looked up from the page and saw that his eyes had closed. She said, "Ranger." He did not open them. She put her hand on the top of his head gently, the way her mother had shown her, and she felt the last soft breath go out of him under her palm. And she understood, in the whole clear way that only a child can understand, that he had finished. She sat with him a long time in the sun. Then she got up and she walked into the house, and she found her mother and her stepfather in the kitchen, and she said, "Ranger went to find Daddy." She did not cry. She said it like a report. Colton Reyes set down his coffee cup. Paige put both hands over her face. Hazel stood between them in the doorway and looked steadily up at them and said, "It is okay." He knew the way. They buried him under the maple tree in the yard, wrapped in a Millbrook police jacket that Denise Ortiz brought over that same night. And Hazel put a small dog toy in the grave beside him, a stuffed elephant with a chewed ear that he had loved since he was a puppy. There was no ceremony. There did not need to be. The whole town already knew. The next morning, the collar on the lamppost downtown had been replaced with a fresh one, and the tag on it had a new year etched under the words, "End of Watch," and the words, "Well done, boy," engraved with a steady hand. And nobody in Millbrook ever asked who had done it, because everyone knew it did not matter. It only mattered that it was done. Colton stood on the porch of the little house that evening with a cold cup of coffee in his hand, looking at the fresh dirt under the maple tree, and thought about a rainy night on Franklin Avenue and the shape that had burst into the road, and thought about a widow face down at the foot of a staircase and a small girl in pink pajamas whispering that Ranger had gone to get help, and thought about a fire in a warehouse 8 months before that, and a police chief in cuffs, and a boy named Owen Marsh, who had lived to play the harmonica at a wedding, and thought about a dog who had never once, in all the years that followed, left the yard again, because this time no one inside needed saving. And he understood, at last and fully, what Devon Whitaker had trained that dog to know, and what Devon had, without ever meaning to, trained him to know too. That the uniform ends, that the badge fades, that the sirens go quiet, that the storm passes. But the watch, if you are lucky enough to be given one, and brave enough to keep it, does not end. Not ever. Not for a good man. Not for a good dog. Not for anyone who has ever loved something enough to stand in the middle of a road in the rain and refuse, absolutely refuse to move. If this story reached you, take a moment to leave a comment, share it with someone who loves an animal the way Paige and Hazel loved Ranger, and subscribe to the channel so the next story finds its way to you too. Because there are more of them. There are always more of them, and someone somewhere is standing in the rain right now, waiting for you to stop.